Hey there. Tonight, we are stepping into a garden that did not begin in Eden at all. It began in the wet breath of southern Mesopotamia, where priests stood above black water and whispered the name of a god who loved wisdom too much to keep it locked away. If that sounds like your kind of night, like the video and settle in with me, because by the end of this first stretch, I want to show you something unsettling. The serpent in the garden may have begun as a god of fresh water, sacred craft, dangerous truth, and the first city on earth. Now let the room grow a little softer around you. Let the day move a little farther off. You do not need to force sleep. Just listen. We are going somewhere damp and silver and dim, to a place where the reeds move in the wind and the mud remembers everything. Imagine the southern edge of Mesopotamia long before empires, before law codes were carved in stone, before scribes had fully covered the world in writing. The land is low and flat and glimmering. Marsh water lies in shining sheets between islands of reed and packed earth. The air is warm. Fish flick beneath the surface. Birds call from the sedge. The horizon is so level it almost feels drawn with a ruler. And rising from that watery plain is a mound, modest at first glance, hardly more than a lifted patch of earth, but marked already by intention. At the top of it stands a simple structure of mud brick. Not a palace, not a fortress, something smaller, older, quieter. A shrine, a room made sacred by repetition. If you were standing there with me, you would smell wet clay, fish oil, marsh plants, and smoke from a small fire curling out into the heavy evening air. You would hear sandals pressing into damp soil. You would hear the soft knock of pottery set down near an altar. And beneath all of it, if you let your mind travel the way ancient minds did, you would feel the presence of hidden water under the earth. This is Eridu. Later, Mesopotamian tradition would remember Eridu as the first city, the first place where kingship descended from heaven, the oldest settled point in the ordered human world. That claim sounded extravagant for a very long time, the sort of thing ancient people like to say about themselves after a few cups and a hymn or two. But then archaeology, stubborn and unromantic archaeology, started pulling the earth apart layer by layer. And there it was, temple under temple, shrine under shrine, level after level of rebuilding. 18 successive sacred structures rising one atop another like memory compressed into mud. 4,000 years of people returning to the same place to say, yes, here is where he belongs. And the god they believed belonged there was Enki. Honestly, I have always found Enki one of the most fascinating figures in the whole ancient world, because he refuses to stay simple. Other gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon can be stern, remote, kingly, warlike, maternal, or severe. Enki is slipperier than that. He is the lord of the deep fresh waters, the hidden aquifer beneath the earth, the keeper of wisdom, the master of magic, the patron of craft, the arranger of life-giving order, the one who understands how things work below the visible layer. He is not merely strong. He is clever. And clever goes, as you know, are never content to sit beautifully on a throne. The priests at Eridu believed that beneath their temple lay the Abzu, the subterranean sea of sweet water from which life itself rises. Not the salt sea of chaos, not the crashing unknown, but the nourishing hidden reservoir that feeds fields, reeds, canals, orchards, cities. The deep source. Enki lived there in imagination and in cult. His shrine on earth mirrored his watery domain below. The very placement of the temple mattered. This was not random real estate. This was a seam between levels of existence. Offerings gathered around him were deeply local, almost intimate. Fish bones piled up around the earliest temple levels. Thousands of them. The remains of meals or rites, gifts or payments, depending on how you choose to see ancient devotion. I like that detail because it makes the whole thing less abstract. This is not just theology floating above the land. This is a wet place, a working place, a place where people smelled the river on their hands and brought the god what the marsh gave them. If you look at later images of Enki, he often appears as a bearded divine figure with streams pouring from his shoulders, sometimes with fish moving through those currents, the Tigris and Euphrates themselves flowing from him like extensions of thought. It is a magnificent image. He does not merely rule the rivers. He emanates them. Civilization in Mesopotamia depended on water management with a kind of anxious devotion that is difficult for modern people to feel in their bones. Water was life, crops, transport, survival, rhythm, continuity. A god of water was a god of everything that made human order possible. But that still does not get to the strange part. The strange part is that Enki was also associated with a title that should make us slow down and look again. He could be called Ushumgal, the Great Serpent, or the Great Dragon. Not in some throwaway decorative sense. Not as a cute little symbol tucked into a corner. In Mesopotamian thought, serpent language mattered. It carried power, fear, venom, transformation, hiddenness, and authority. When a god bore that image, the point was not that he was animal, like in some childish way. The point was that he belonged to the ancient class of beings who move between categories, who can bless and poison with the same mouth, who know things others do not. One hymn speaks of Enki with a shiver under its praise. His word is like a flood wave. His speech can be venom. He stands with those who are true and against those who are not. There is always something edged about him. He is not your soft, smiling grandfather in the clouds. He is generous, yes, but never harmless. He helps, but often by means of trickery. He protects, but he does so in ways that unsettle the structure above him. He is wise, and wisdom in the ancient world was not imagined as pleasant. That matters, because once you begin to see Enki clearly, a pattern emerges. He is again and again the god who possesses what should be guarded, and then, somehow, rather suspiciously, rather beautifully, lets it slip into wider circulation. The Mesopotamians believed in powers called the Me, divine decrees, sacred principles, the structures that make civilization possible. These were not just airy ideas. They were closer to operative realities. Kingship, priesthood, music, writing, craft, ordered rule, erotic power, ritual offices, social forms, the whole package that turns scattered human existence into something dense and urban and radiant. Enki was their keeper, and yet he is forever giving things away. In one famous story, the ambitious goddess Inanna comes to visit him in Eridu. There is feasting, there is beer, there is ceremony with that subtle undertone ancient stories love, the sense that everyone in the room knows more is happening than anyone is saying directly. Enki drinks. Inanna charms. The me begin to pass from hand to hand, one after another, more than 100 of them, until what should have remained guarded in Eridu is sailing away toward Uruk in the hold of a divine boat. When Enki sobers, he regret it. Naturally, there is pursuit. There is fuss. There is attempted retrieval. But the deed is done. Knowledge has moved. Civilization has spread. Order has left its first guarded chamber and entered the wider human field. You can read the story as comedy, if you like. I suspect the ancient audience sometimes did. Drunken God loses the keys to civilization. Not exactly flattering. But beneath the humor is a more serious truth. Enki keeps becoming the channel through which forbidden or restricted power reaches others. That is where the room should get very still. Because the moment you notice that pattern, you are already much closer to Eden than you might expect. Think of the basic shape. A divine authority guards knowledge. A boundary is set. A mediator appears, cunning, articulate, uncomfortable with the restriction. Humanity receives what was not supposed to be available. The result is irreversible. Nothing remains innocent afterward. Whatever else changes from culture to culture, that structure survives. Now, let us move slowly, because this is where people often rush and flatten everything into a neat slogan. Enki is not simply the serpent in Eden in some childish costume drama, as though one myth put on a fake beard and wandered into another one by mistake. It is subtler than that. Older mythic functions survive, migrate, blend, invert, and reappear under new theological rules. That is why the comparison is so interesting. We are watching a deep narrative role travel from one world into another. In Genesis, the serpent is described as crafty, more subtle than the other creatures. That word matters. It suggests intelligence, shrewdness, perception. The serpent is not a barking villain smashing plates for the pleasure of it. The serpent notices. The serpent speaks in precise terms. The serpent asks the question that opens the sealed room. And the serpent tells the truth. That part has always made religious authorities a little uneasy, which frankly is understandable. The serpent tells Eve that eating the fruit will not produce immediate death in the simple way the warning suggests. Instead, her eyes will be opened. She and Adam will become like gods in knowing good and evil. And that is exactly what happens. Their eyes are opened. They do gain a new kind of awareness. Even the divine voice in the narrative confirms it. The human has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. It is awkward material if you want the serpent to be a pure liar. Ancient Mesopotamian stories are full of gods who fight over what humanity should know, how much we should receive, and whether we should remain narrow, manageable, and dependent. Enki almost always stands on the side of widening the field. He is the one who cannot quite keep wisdom padlocked. He is the one who shares, leaks, teaches, advises, and rearranges outcomes by means of cunning. He is, in other words, exactly the kind of figure who could survive into a later garden story as a dangerous knowledge giver. And there is one more piece of the atmosphere to place around him before we rest this first part. Eridu was not merely a temple. It was remembered as a watered, sacred center in the midst of the plain, a cultivated zone tied to deep waters and fruitfulness. Enki was associated with planted abundance, with the ordering of fertility, with the making of places where life could thrive against the surrounding harshness. If later readers imagined a holy garden at the source of rivers in the east, watched over by a being linked to hidden wisdom and boundary crossing, they were not imagining from nothing. They were inheriting old landscape memories, old sacred geography, and old theological tensions. So here by the fire, with the room gone quiet and the night leaning closer, let us keep just this much in our hands for now. Before the serpent became a villain, before Eden was read as a simple morality play, before later tradition laid heavier and heavier shadows across the scene, there stood in the marsh world of ancient Mesopotamia a god of deep water, sacred craft, truth edged with danger, and knowledge too potent to remain locked away. He was enthroned at Eridu. He was called Wise. He was called Serpent. And he had a habit of giving humanity far more than the rest of heaven seemed comfortable with. That is where the real unease begins. Not with a hiss in a tree, but with a shrine in wet earth, a god beneath the floor, and a civilization that remembered its first great benefactor as a serpent lord of wisdom. If we keep following Enki through the old stories, the air changes. The shrine at Eridu is no longer enough by itself. The god begins to move through myth in the way that truly old gods do, with repeating gestures, repeating loyalties, repeating acts of interference. And every time he appears, one tension comes with him. Will human beings remain safely limited? Or will someone hand us more than we were meant to hold? To understand why that matters so much for Eden, we have to spend a little time with a man named Adapa. Adapa enters the old stories quietly, as priest, servant, and wise man of Eridu. He belongs to Enki. He serves in the god's sacred sphere. He prepares food, tends ritual obligation, and moves within that narrow zone where human and divine business come unusually close together. In many ways, he is the ideal early human figure. Capable, disciplined, and very gifted. Enki made him wise. That phrase is one of those ancient sentences that looks simple until you let it sit beside you for a while. Enki gave Adapa wisdom, but not eternal life. That is already the whole wound in miniature. Knowledge may be granted. Immortality remains withheld. A human being may come near the divine level in perception, in technique, in understanding, and still remain under the sentence of mortality. Mesopotamian tradition returns to that distinction again and again. The story begins on the water. Adapa is out fishing on the Persian Gulf, serving his god in the most ordinary sacred way imaginable. Through duty, supply, offering, lavor. The boat rocks. The wind rises. The south wind, personified as a lesser divine power, overturns him with such force that the story suddenly turns from service to insult. Adapa is not merely inconvenienced. He is thrown, soaked, furious, breathing hard. So Adapa does something extraordinary. Using the incantatory power Enki has taught him, he breaks the wing of the south wind. Just pause there with me. A mortal injures a divine force through knowledge given by a god. Already you can feel the old Stwendories leaning toward the same dangerous point. What makes a human dangerous is not brute strength. It is taught wisdom, operative speech, the ability to use hidden structure against larger power. Adapa does not build a tower or raise an army. He speaks correctly, and the wind fails. The sky god, Anu, notices. The cosmic order has been disturbed. A wind has ceased. Things that should move are not moving. Somewhere above, a supreme authority asks the oldest bureaucratic question in history. Who authorized this? Adapa is summoned to heaven. There is something almost tender in what comes next, though it is also where Enki begins to look less like a simple benefactor and more like the sort of wise protector whose help can injure as easily as it saves. Before Adapa ascends, Enki instructs him carefully. Wear mourning clothes. Show humility. Speak with respect to the gate guardians. Win their sympathy. In other words, survive the court. It is marvelous advice, shrewd and precise. But then comes the deadly part. Enki tells Adapa that once he stands before Anu, food and drink may be offered to him. He must refuse them. They are, Enki says, the bread of death and the water of death. So Adapa goes upward, carrying wisdom and caution at once. Picture the ascent not as a cartoon ladder through clouds, but as a ritual crossing. Earth smell falling away, the hush of the marsh replaced by a brightness too large for comfort. At the gate stand Dumuzi and Ningishzida, guardians of threshold and fate. Adapa speaks well. He has listened to Enki. He wins favor. Again, we see the basic shape. Knowledge preserves him. Clever speech preserves him. Access depends on understanding more than on obedience. When he reaches Anu, something unexpected happens. The supreme god is not immediately murderous. He is curious. He is impressed. There is even a kind of amused admiration. This mortal is unusual. This mortal carries an intelligence too fine for ordinary earth. So Anu does what changes everything. He offers Adapa the bread of life and the water of life. Not death. Life. This may be one of the saddest scenes in the entire ancient archive. The thing denied to humanity in later traditions. The thing fenced off. The thing kept just beyond reach is suddenly held out openly. And the human being, trained by wisdom, protected by caution, loyal to his God, says no. He says no because he trusts the wrong instruction at the decisive moment. This is the inversion that should make anyone interested in Eden sit upright. In Genesis, forbidden food is eaten, and with it comes awakened knowledge, but loss of access to life. In Adapa, life-giving food is refused, and with it comes the confirmation that humanity will remain mortal despite wisdom. In one story, disobedience opens the human condition. In the other, obedience seals it. Either way, the same tension holds. Knowledge and immortality do not arrive together. Something about being human in these ancient traditions means receiving one and missing the other. Anu, seeing what has happened, laughs or laments depending on the telling, but the damage is done. Adapa is sent back to Earth, still brilliant, still favored in a certain sense, but doomed to die. Humanity gains no endless life from this brush with heaven. We gain widened awareness and a sharper version of the wound. And once you have sat with Adapa long enough, Eden starts to look different. The serpent in Genesis tells Eve that her eyes will be opened, that she and Adam will become like the divine in knowing. This happens. The warning from the higher authority is not the whole picture. The mediator speaks the operative truth. In Adapa, Enki does almost the opposite. He gives a warning that preserves loyalty but costs humanity immortality. One story presents the knowledge giver as truer than the ruler. The other presents the wise protector as the one whose counsel keeps the species bounded. That may sound like a contradiction, but it is really the old Mesopotamian paradox, returning in a new form. Enki helps humanity, yes, but he does not simply hand over everything. He is a giver of wisdom inside a cosmos that still keeps limits. He widens the human field, but not without complication, not without cost, not without a kind of tragic cleverness. That complexity is exactly what later traditions struggle to digest. Simple religions prefer simple villains and simple heroes. Enki is maddening because he is neither, and he is not finished. If Adapa shows us knowledge and immortality pulling apart, the flood traditions show us something else. Enki as the god who cannot stop siding with humanity even when the larger divine order has turned against us. The story is told most powerfully in Atrahasis. At the beginning, the world is burdened by labor. The lesser gods, the workers, Dihkanals, maintain the system, do the exhausting, endless work needed to keep the cosmic and earthly machine operating. After ages of toil, the workers revolt. Tools are burned. Anger gathers. The great gods must decide what to do. And Enki proposes the solution that will become our species. Create humans. Not from pure love, not from abstract artistic delight, but from need. We are made to bear the load. Clay is mixed with divine material. Blood and earth. Mind and mud. Labor and intention. It is one of the oldest and most unsettling anthropologies ever written down. We are useful. Designed. Servant, at least in origin. And yet, even here, where humanity is made for labor, Enki does not behave like a simple overseer. Once humans exist, he becomes our advocate with almost embarrassing consistency. We multiply. We make noise. We disturb Enlil, the harsher authority, the one more inclined toward order through reduction. Plagicomus. Enki teaches the humans how to survive it. Drought comes. Enki provides the ritual workaround. Famine comes. Enki opens another path. Again and again, the larger system tries to narrow or destroy human life. And again, Enki bends sideways, finding loopholes, rerouting outcomes, slipping knowledge through the cracks. Then comes the flood. The decision is not always framed as rage in the modern emotional sense. It is colder than that. Humanity has become excessive, too numerous, too loud, too difficult. The solution is comprehensive reduction. Water will do what plague and famine did not complete. A world will be washed down to manageable scale. The gods swear secrecy. No one is to warn the humans. And here Enki becomes fully, unmistakably, the patron of subversion. He cannot break the oath directly, so he speaks to a reed wall, knowing the man on the other side will hear. Tear down your house, build a boat, save life. He does not shout. He does not overturn the council openly. He does something more like what the serpent in a later garden does. He speaks the forbidden thing in a form just indirect enough to pass. I have always loved that image. The reed wall listening. It is almost comic, and then suddenly it is heartbreaking. A god bound by hierarchy, still finding a way to leak mercy into the human world. The man hears. The vessel is built. Bitumen seals the seams. Family, craftsmen, animals, the seeds of continuation, all are gathered while the horizon darkens. When the flood comes, it comes with the old cruelty of total events. Water erases distinctions. Roofline, road, field, shrine, threshold, all vanish under the same pounding gray. And when at last it recedes, the survivors offer sacrifice. The gods gather around the smoke because they have been starving without human offerings. The powers who nearly erased humanity discover they cannot quite live without us. So humanity continues, but not unchanged. The post-flood world is narrower. Lifespans contract. Mortality settles more heavily. This is where the Mesopotamian imagination begins to sound almost modern in its melancholy. There was a before, it says, but you do not live there now. What survives does so under tighter terms. And Enki remains what he has always been. The one who made us, the one who warned us, the one who gave us enough to survive but not enough to escape the whole design. A benefactor, yes. Also a boundary keeper of a peculiar kind. He gives the dangerous gift of awareness and technique, but immortality keeps slipping out of reach. He saves the species, but not from death itself. He tells the truth sideways. He protects through cunning. He remains, in every sense, a serpent mind. So if part of you has been wondering whether the path from Enki to Eden is too bold, too speculative, too neat, sit for a moment with the larger pattern instead of the single label. A god of wisdom, a giver of restricted knowledge, a protector of humanity against more severe divine authority, a figure associated with serpent power, a being who changes human destiny through speech rather than force, a world in which food, knowledge, and life are all contested between divine and human spheres. That is the real inheritance. That is the deep narrative current moving beneath later scripture. The garden has not appeared yet in full. The tree has not fully risen, but now we know the atmosphere in which both become possible. We know the wet world of Eridu. We know the bread refused in heaven. We know the reed wall that heard what should not have been said. And we know that by the time a serpent begins speaking in a later garden, the ancient world has already spent centuries imagining that the being most likely to change human destiny is not the obedient servant of order, but the cunning divine friend who hands humanity more than heaven intended. The next door opens not in a garden, but in a heavenly court. And I think that is exactly where this mystery has to go if we want to understand why the later Eden story feels so sharp, so morally charged, and so painfully intimate. A garden can hide many things under leaves and fruit and shade. Heaven cannot. In heaven, the stakes come out into the open. Food means life. Speech means fate. A warning can become the hinge on which the whole human condition turns. So let us go back to Adapa, but this time more slowly, because he deserves that. Ancient stories often move faster than our emotions can follow. They tell you that a man was wise, summoned, tested, and returned, all in a few compact lines. But if you let the moment breathe, it becomes one of the most haunting scenes in the whole Mesopotamian world. Adapa was not a king. That matters. He was not a conqueror, not a founder of cities, not the kind of figure who wins glory by force. He was a ritual man, a Templar man, a servant of Eridu, and therefore a servant of Enki. He baked. He poured. He arranged. He maintained sacred order in small, repeated acts. There is something beautifully ordinary about that. The man nearest one of the deepest secrets in ancient myth begins as someone doing his job. Enki had given him wisdom. The text says this clearly, and it says it with a kind of calm that should make us uneasy. Wisdom was not something Adapa grew by himself like a tree in an open field. It was granted, transferred, bestowed. In that way, he resembles humanity in the broader Mesopotamian imagination. We are not originators of the highest things. We are receivers of them, are sometimes grateful, sometimes reckless, sometimes tragic. Yet Enki did not give him eternal life. There it is again, the split that will later haunt Eden. Knowledge on one side, immortality on the other. Nearness to the divine without equality to the divine. The old world between the rivers keeps circling this wound as though it cannot stop touching it. The day the crisis begins is almost laughably small in its beginning. Adapa goes out onto the water to fish. You can picture the gulf breathing under a pale sky, the light broken into glitter by little waves, the smell of salt and marsh, the narrow boat moving with the confidence of habit. He has likely done this many times. Then the south wind rises and overturns him. Suddenly, the calm order of service is shattered by insult, by inconvenience. by the raw physical humiliation of being thrown into the water. And Adapa reacts with knowledge, not with a spear, not with a shout, with a spoken act. He breaks the wing of the south wind. That image has always fascinated me. A human being, armed with divinely given wisdom, can damage one of the powers that move the world. It is an astonishing admission. Humans in this tradition are weak in body, fragile in lifespan, exposed to flood and plague. But give one of them the right knowledge, and even a wind can limp. No wonder heaven notices. Anu, the sky god, the high authority above the other authorities, realizes that the south wind has failed to rise. Something has happened in the human sphere that has reached upward and changed the celestial order. The offender is summoned. Adapa must come to heaven. This is where the story becomes unbearable, in the quiet way only old stories can manage. Enki prepares him with enormous care. Wear mourning garments. Let your hair hang properly. Speak humbly at the gate. If Dumuzi and Ningishzida question you, tell them you mourn their absence from earth. Earn their sympathy. The advice is politically brilliant. Enki knows courts. He knows thresholds. He knows that survival often depends less on innocence than on reading the room correctly. So far, he is the perfect protector. Then he says the fatal thing. If Anu offers you bread, do not eat it. If he offers you water, do not drink it. They are the bread of death and the water of death. Adapa listens. Why would he not? This is the God who made him wise, the God whose city he serves, the God whose counsel has already given him the power to harm a wind. Loyalty in ancient stories is not casual. It sits inside the bones. So Adapa obeys before the test has even begun. He carries obedience upward with him like a sealed jar. Imagine that ascent. The marsh air falling away, the simple sounds of Eridu, sandals, bowls, birds, water, all left behind. The brightness growing harder, thinner, more exact. The gates of heaven not as cartoon clouds, but as places of protocol, where posture and wording matter. Dumuzi and Ningishzida stand there, and Adapa says the right thing, because Enki taught him well. Already, the pattern is clear. Human survival depends on mediated knowledge. Nothing is open. Everything is guided by instruction. Then Adapa stands before Anu. What happens next is one of the most devastating reversals in all early myth. Anu is not simply enraged. He is intrigued. This mortal who broke the wind is not treated as vermin. He is examined, spoken to, almost admired. And then, the highest God offers him exactly what humanity lacks. Bread of life, water of life, not death. Life. The room must go very still here, because Adapa refuses. He refuses politely, loyally, correctly, and utterly. He refuses because he trusts the wisdom that formed him. And in that refusal, the gap between knowledge and immortality is sealed. The human being can be wise enough to stand in heaven and still return to earth under sentence of death. If you are wondering why this matters so much for Eden, it is because the structure is almost too close to ignore. In both stories, humanity stands near a divinely guarded threshold marked by food. In both stories, a mediator alters the outcome. In both stories, knowledge and life do not arrive together. In both stories, what humans become is determined not by brute force, but by speech, prohibition, interpretation, and one unbearable choice near sacred food. The difference is even more revealing. In Genesis, the serpent tells Eve that eating will open the eyes and bring godlike knowledge. He is correct. In Adapa, Enki tells his human servant that refusing the heavenly food will preserve him from death. He is wrong, or perhaps strategic in a way that remains chilling. Either way, the result is the same. Humanity does not receive immortal life. Some scholars see Enki here as protecting cosmic order, or as preserving the difference between divine and human stations. Others see a more political divine rivalry behind the scene, with Enki unwilling to let Anu raise a mortal too high. It is debated, and fairly so. But whichever reading one prefers, the emotional truth is hard to escape. The God of wisdom becomes the very one whose counsel keeps humanity bounded. That is what makes Enki so much more interesting than a simple Eden serpent equation. He is not a one-note rebel. He is a paradox. He expands the human mind and limits the human horizon at the same time. He is the giver and the restrainer. He is intimate with humanity, but not always in the way humanity would choose. And this paradox continues in the flood traditions, where his divided loyalties become even clearer. The Atrahasis story begins in labor and resentment. The lesser divine workers, the ones assigned the heavy burdens of maintaining canals and carrying the practical weight of cosmic administration, become exhausted. They rebel. Their tools burn in the night. Their anger gathers around the house of Enlil. It is one of the oldest labor disputes in literature, which is both grim and faintly funny in the way history often is. Apparently, even the gods eventually decide management has become unbearable. The solution is humanity. We are created to carry the load. Clay is mixed with divine material. Flesh and task are joined. This is not a flattering beginning, but it is a profound one. It means that, from the start, human beings in Mesopotamian thought are shaped by transferred capacities. We are made to work, yes, but also made with enough intelligence to perform, maintain, and continue. The first humans are not idiots with tools. They are functional, teachable, responsive, and already woven into divine politics. Enki is central in this making. He is the one tied to creation, to clever adaptation, to the solving of impossible administrative problems. Yet, as humanity multiplies, the old tension returns. The humans become noisy, too numerous, too difficult. Enlil, who represents a harder line of order, keeps turning toward reduction. Plague, drought, famine, pressure from above. Each crisis is meant to narrow the human field. And each time, Enki intervenes. He advises. He leaks ritual knowledge. He teaches ways around the destruction. He finds loopholes in divine decrees. He behaves less like a loyal minister and more like the cosmic equivalent of the clever uncle who knows the household rules are unfair and keeps slipping the children a map of the back door. There is humor in that image. I know, but I think it is useful. Without it, the story becomes too rigid. Enki is not cold. He is cunning with sympathy. He is on humanity's side often enough to make his darker moments with Adapa even more painful. He is never easy to sort. Then comes the flood. The large answer, the water answer. Humanity will be washed away. The divine assembly binds itself to secrecy. No one is to warn the humans. But Enki, again, does not quite obey in the expected way. He speaks not directly to the chosen survivor, but to the reed wall of his house. It is one of the loveliest scenes in ancient literature, and perhaps one of the saddest too. A god constrained by oath finds a way to tell the truth sideways. Reed wall, pay attention. House wall, listen. Tear down the house. Build a boat. That is serpent behavior in the deepest mythic sense. Not merely snake behavior, but boundary-crossing intelligence. Speech that slides under rules without quite breaking them in the obvious form. Forbidden knowledge passing through a narrow opening into human hands. Enki is once more the mediator of dangerous truth. The man builds. The vessel is sealed in bitumen. Family, craftsmen, animals, seeds of continuity. All are gathered while the weather turns monstrous. The flood rises. Cities go under. The world is reduced. And when the waters finally fall away, humanity survives, but altered. The post-flood order is smaller, tighter, shorter-lived. The old enormous spans of the antediluvian kings collapse into something closer to our own cramped sense of time. And there again is the pattern that links back to Eden. Humanity receives knowledge, survive catastrophe, enters history more sharply awake than before, but not into paradise, into burden, into mortality, into a world where wisdom exists beside irreversibility. By the end of this part, I want one image to remain with you. Not a serpent in a tree just yet, but a man in heaven, standing before bread and water he should have taken, and a God below heaven speaking to a reed wall because direct mercy has been forbidden. Between those two scenes lies the entire old Mesopotamian ache. Humanity is brought close to divine things, close enough to change forever, but never quite allowed to keep the whole gift. And if later tradition remembered that ache as a serpent speaking in a garden, then it remembered something real about Enki, the god who always stood nearest the locked door and who so often could not resist telling us what was on the other side. If part of you is already feeling that Enki alone may be too complicated, too layered, too contradictory to become the later serpent by himself, then you are following exactly the right instinct. Ancient myths rarely travel intact. They travel like river water, taking on silt, other streams, and, whatever the banks allow, by the time a very old divine roll reaches a later sacred text, it often carries more than one ancestry in its current. And that brings us to another figure whose shadow coils quietly behind Eden. His name is Ningishzida. The name is usually translated as Lord of the Good Tree, and that alone should make us pause. A serpent-linked divine being, a lord of a sacred tree, a guardian associated with thresholds, the underworld, renewal, and hidden passage between states of being. Even before we open the details, the atmosphere is already suspiciously familiar. Ningishzida is one of those Mesopotamian gods who feels older than the sharpest stories told about him. He belongs to roots, to trunk, to gate, to the dark below from which life and death both rise. In some texts, he appears as a deity of vegetation and cyclical return. In others, he serves as a guardian of divine doorways. In visual art, he is closely tied to serpents, sometimes shown with snakes rising around a staff or entwined in ways that later ages would find oddly recognizable. He is not simply a snake god. He is a being of vertical movement, downward into earth, upward through trunk, sideways through thresholds between worlds. That combination matters immensely. If Enki gives us the profile of the dangerous wisdom god, Ningishzida gives us the profile of the sacred serpent at the tree and the gate. Put those two profiles together, and you begin to see how later tradition could compress them into one unforgettable figure. The serpent in Eden is not just clever. It is positioned at the tree of knowledge. It stands at a threshold of human becoming. It mediates passage from innocence into consciousness, from one state of life into another. That is Ningishzida territory as much as Enki territory. Let us stay with him for a little while, because the old visual world around Ningishzida is worth moving through slowly. Mesopotamian seals and cups sometimes show paired serpents rising in a balanced form around a central staff or pole. Modern viewers immediately think of later healing emblems, and not without reason. But in the ancient setting, the meaning is even wider. Serpents do not only mean poison, they mean renewal, because they shed skins. They mean rooted knowledge, because they move near the earth. They mean access to what is hidden. They mean danger. Yes, but also passage. There is a votive cup from Lagash, often mentioned in discussions of Ningishzida, a cup associated with Gudea, the ruler who adored old sacred symbolism. Its imagery has a strange calm to it when you first see it. Serpents rise. A staff stands. Order is implied. But the longer you look, the more it begins to feel like a theological diagram. Not house. Controlled crossing. Forces balanced around a central line. Healing and peril combined. That, too, is worth holding beside Eden. Because the Eden serpent does something more complex than merely tempt. It introduces transition. Before the conversation, Adam and Eve are in one condition. After the conversation, they are in another. Eyes opened. Shame awakened. Mortality made explicit. Exil imminent. The serpent is the agent of passage, and passage is exactly the realm of Ningishzida, whose whole symbolic world is organized around movement between levels. He is also connected, crucially, to the underworld. No, that can sound grim to modern ears. But the underworld in Mesopotamian thought is not just a cartoon pit of punishment. It is the place below, the place of roots, of ancestors, of hidden continuity, of powers that outlast the visible world. A god associated with it is often a god of dangerous knowledge, because to know what lies beneath ordinary life is already to have crossed a line. Ningishzida guards and mediates that line. This is why his appearance in the Adapa tradition is so intriguing. At the gate of heaven, Adapa encounters Dumuzi and Ningishzida. Think about that for a moment. The human being closest to losing or gaining immortal life is received not by random attendants, but by a pair that includes the serpent-linked tree lord of thresholds. This is not decorative casting. Ancient literature is too economical for that. The gate has the right keeper because the gate is the point, and Adapa passes through that point only provisionally. I find that fascinating because it suggests the Mesopotamian archive already knew how to think about sacred access in a very botanical, very vertical way. Tree, wacht, gate, ascent, descent, heaven above, underworld below, human life moving nervously between them. A serpent-linked god stationed where the crossing occurs. By the time we reach Genesis, the image has been simplified. Yes, but not invented from nothing. It has an ancestry. Now let us bring the garden itself closer. The biblical Garden of Eden is so familiar to many people that it can be hard to recover how strange it is. A planted sanctuary, rivers flowing outward, a tree of life, a tree of knowledge, a serpent, divine walking presence, human beings in a state both sheltered and incomplete. Every element of that scene begins to look less isolated when placed beside southern Mesopotamian sacred geography. There is even a linguistic whisper in the background. The Sumerian word Eden refers not to a walled flower garden in the later European sense, but to open plain, uncultivated steppe, the stretch beyond the city where shepherding and danger both live. Over time, sacred cultivated space and open plain interact in ways that make the later Eden feel less like a sudden invention and more like a transformed memory. A place at the edge of ordered life. A first landscape where divine and human meet. Eridu itself, with its fresh water source and its sacred planted imagery, is often described in texts that make it sound less like a normal town and more like a watered, sacred center. Enki's house is near the deep. Canals and life flow outward. Abundance stands inside fragile order. If you imagine a later tradition condensing many older details, a holy watered place tied to the source of civilizational life, guarded by divine power, marked by a dangerous knowledge giver, you are not far from Eden at all. And then there is Dilmun. Dilmun in Mesopotamian myth is not exactly Eridu, but it belongs to the same symbolic world of pure place. Bright place, first place. In the myth of Enki and Ningishzida, it appears as a land of freshness and radiance, a place where sickness and predation have not yet fully entered. It has often been described as a paradise motif, and that description is fair as long as we do not make it too sentimental. Mesopotamian paradise is never merely soft. It is always charged, always one step away from consequence. In that story, Enki's actions around plants, desire, and transgression produce bodily consequence. He consumes what is not simply his to consume. The result is affliction spread through the body. Ninhursag must respond. Healing follows offense. Order follows misuse. It is not Eden directly, but once again the ingredients gather. Sacred place. Divine boundary crossing. Plant consumption. Altered bodily state. Loss of original ease. Some readers have long noticed one especially curious detail. A word play in the myth links the Lady of the Rib with the Lady of Life in a way that has tempted comparison with Eve, later called the mother of all living and associated with Adam's side in Genesis. The comparison is debated, and it should be handled carefully. It is not a neat one-to-one borrowing. Still, the resonance is there, and when many small resonances gather, they begin to form weather. This is the larger point. We do not need one perfect match to see inheritance. Ancient tradition do not photocopy. They reshape. They moralize. They compress. They transfer the emotional structure while changing the theological surface. The Hebrew writers who shaped Genesis were not working in a vacuum. They lived in a world saturated with older Mesopotamian story patterns, sacred geographies, flood memories, divine counsels, and inherited mythic roles. During the Babylonian exile, that contact became especially sharp. Judean elites lived under Mesopotamian imperial power. In the land where these stories had long circulated and where scribal culture had been refining them for centuries, if ever there were conditions for deep story transfer, that was one of them. And what happens when an older polytheistic archive enters a stricter monotheistic frame? Roles must be redistributed. Powers once held by many beings have to be sorted. A wisdom god cannot remain fully himself if all ultimate sovereignty now belongs to one high god. The dangerous knowledge giver must be displaced. The threshold serpent must be demoted. The old divine benefactor may survive, but only in altered form, compressed into a creature, stripped of official divinity, morally darkened, and set against the one God rather than beside or beneath other gods in a divine order. That is why the serpent in Eden feels so strangely overqualified for the role of mere animal. It speaks too well. It knows too much. It understands the stakes too clearly. It is not simply sneaky. It is a theological refugee. I know that sounds dramatic, but I mean it very precisely. What you are hearing in Eden may be the afterlife of several older sacred roles forced into a new narrative economy. Enki contributes the profile of the wisdom giver, the friend of humanity, the one who disrupts restriction through cunning speech. Ningishzida contributes the serpentry threshold profile, the guardian of dangerous crossing, the being near gates, roots, and transformation. The later author of Genesis does not need to name either god directly for their narrative functions to survive in the serpent's body. There is even a bitter elegance in how the transformation works. The older Mesopotamian tradition could tolerate divine ambiguity. A god could be generous and dangerous, truthful and manipulative, life-giving and limit-keeping. Monotheism prefers sharper moral lines. So what happens to the old ambiguous benefactor? He becomes the adversarial voice in the garden. The role remains, but the moral lighting changes. That is one reason I think the Eden serpent has endured so powerfully. Deep down, it still carries the complexity of its ancestors. It never quite behaves like a flat villain. It says too little and too much at once. It opens a door and leaves the listeners to deal with what lies beyond. It has the ancient serpent quality of shedding the skin that later theology tried to place over it. And perhaps that is why the scene remains so alive. Not because it is simple, but because it is not. A woman stands before a tree. A speaking serpent names the hidden possibility. A command trembles in the background. Knowledge waits like fruit in the hand. Beneath that scene stand older marsh temples, older gatekeepers, older serpent lords, older gardens watered from the deep. The Bible narrows the cast, but the older world is still there in the roots. By the close of this part, I want that image to stay with you. Not just a snake in branches, but roots under the tree. Roots going down through Hebrew scripture into Babylonian soil, then farther down into Sumerian mud, into Eridu, into the shrine of Enki, into the symbolic gates guarded by Ningishzida. What later faith made into one scene of temptation may have begun as something more complicated, and in some ways more tragic. A memory of divine beings who carried knowledge to humans across sacred thresholds, and who were later recast as the reason paradise was lost. By now, the garden has grown roots, and those roots run down through scripture into older soil, wetter soil, older than Israel, older than Babylon, older even than the great later kingdoms that liked to believe they stood at the center of everything. If we keep following those roots, they lead us back toward the oldest sacred landscapes of southern Mesopotamia, and back toward a question that the Eden story hides in plain sight. If the serpent was never just an animal, then what exactly was the garden? What place, what memory, what sacred geography was later turned into that small and unbearable scene of fruit, command, speech, and exile? To answer that, we need to leave the tree for a little while and return to the water. Ancient Mesopotamian civilization did not begin in mountain air or in hard, bright desert. It began in mud, in reed marsh, in the long, damp, breathing edge where river water met earth and made life possible through endless patience. The people who lived there did not imagine sacredness as something far from irrigation, fish, canals, and wet soil. They imagined sacredness as flowing through them. Water was order. Water was wealth. Water was survival. Water was the hidden agreement between heaven, earth, and human labor. No water, no barley. No vater, no dates. No water, no city. No water, no temple. That is why Enki matters so much. He is not only a wisdom god in the abstract. He is the lord of the deep, sweet water, the keeper of the Abzu beneath the earth, the divine intelligence hidden under visible ground. In later imagination, his temple at Eridu was not simply built near water. It was built over the deep. His sacred house sat above the source. above the concealed reservoir from which ordered life could rise. If you stood in that temple, the world would feel layered. Mud brick underfoot, cool darkness in the chamber, offerings set down in ritual sequence, and below, imagined but powerfully real, the freshwater deep where the god of wisdom kept his silence. Now compare that atmosphere to Eden. In Genesis, the garden is not merely decorative. It is planted by God. A river goes out from it and then parts into 4 branches. Life flows outward from sacred center into the wider world. That image is beautiful, but it is also remarkably Mesopotamian. The world between the rivers thought in exactly that way. Sacred center, outward flow, irrigated life, order emerging from a source. The geography of Eden is not Greek, not Egyptian, not some vague nowhere. It feels Eastern because it is saturated with the memory of the great river world. People often notice the 4 rivers and then hurry on, but the rivers are not a small detail. They are the whole mood of the place. They tell us that Eden is not just a moral theater. It is a sacred source zone. That matters because Eridu, too, was imagined as a source zone, a beginning place. Not merely old, but first. Not merely important, but foundational. The city where kingship descended. The city where the arts of ordered life were first held close. The city of Enki. If you sit with that long enough, the parallels become harder to ignore. A first sacred place. A life-giving water source. Divine presence. Civilization and order emerging outward. Dangerous wisdom nearby. A boundary between protected innocence and wider knowledge. The 2 stories are not identical, but they breathe the same air. There is another ancient place we need to bring into the room, and that place is Dilmun. Dilmun in Mesopotamian literature is one of those regions that shimmer at the edge of geography and myth. Sometimes it appears like a real place far to the south, tied to trade and bright lands over the Gulf. Sometimes it appears more like a sacred ideal, a radiant zone of purity and firstness. In the myth of Enki and Ningishzida, it is described in terms that almost ache with pre-fall stillness. It is clean, bright, untouched by ordinary forms of suffering. No raven crias. No lion kills. No wolf seizes lamb. The place has the calm of an early world before harshness has fully entered. That alone should make any reader of Eden slow down, because later biblical tradition also imagines an early planted place where ordinary suffering has not yet settled into full form. It is not that Dilmun and Eden are the same location in any literal sense. It is that they share a narrative temperature. They are worlds of first harmony, worlds whose peace feels exquisite precisely because it will not last. And then Enki enters that place and does what Enki always seems to do. He crosses a line. The story of Enki and Ningishzida is strange, playful, unsettling, and difficult to reduce to one neat meaning. Desires move through it. Plants matter. Consumption matters. The body matters. Enki eats what has been generated through sacred process, and his action leads to affliction. Pain enters through misuse of what should have been handled differently. Ningishzida must later respond through acts of healing that restore what his excess has damaged. You can already feel why later readers keep circling this myth when they think about Eden. Sacred place. Special plants. Consumption linked to consequence. A body altered by crossing a limit. Healing following violation. The similarities are not exact, but they are intimate enough to matter. Ancient traditions often preserve themselves not through perfect copying, but through recurring combinations. If a cluster of motifs appears again and again, it usually means memory is still at work. One of the most discussed details in this whole comparison is the peculiar rib and life resonance in the Enki and Ningishzida material. A goddess associated with the rib is also linked through wordplay to life-giving restoration. Later, in Genesis, woman comes from the side of the man and becomes the mother of all living. I want to be careful here. This is not a tidy proof. It is not the sort of thing an honest reader should wave around like a solved equation. But it is the kind of old literary echo that keeps tugging at the sleeve. Not enough to force certainty, enough to keep the room unsettled. And perhaps unsettling is exactly the right response. Because what we are discovering is not a simplistic borrowing, but a deeper process by which old sacred patterns survive inside newer theological forms. The writers of Genesis were not copying a Sumerian myth like students copying homework before class. They were inheriting a whole world of images already old in their own time. Gardens, rivers, first cities, sacred trees, wisdom gods, dangerous speech, food tied to altered human fate. These things had been circulating for centuries, refined by temple schools, reshaped by empires, carried through exile, and translated from one sacred language into another. That last part is especially important. Translation does not only change words, it changes moral emphasis. It changes which figure gets to remain divine and which one must be pushed downward into lesser status. In a polytheistic cosmos, a cunning wisdom, God can live alongside harsher divine powers. In a monotheistic story, the same narrative role becomes harder to place. The wisdom giver who challenges prohibition cannot remain comfortably inside the identity of the one supreme God. So he shifts outward. He becomes the serpent. The role survives, but the official dignity does not. What gets lost in that shift is sympathy. The Mesopotamian world could imagine Enki as dangerous and still admirable. It could hold together water, wisdom, fertility, trickery, protection, and serpent power without panicking. Later theology tends to become more nervous. Once the story is retold within a sharper moral frame, the knowledge giver becomes suspect. The one who opens the human mind becomes the cause of exile. The old benefactor darkens. That is why returning to Eridu matters. It restores context. It lets us see that the serpent in the garden may be carrying not merely rebellion, but memory of an older divine function. It may be preserving the trace of a god who was originally tied to the source of ordered life itself. If you were standing at Eridu at dusk, the sky bruising purple over the marsh, insects beginning their thin music, temple walls holding the day's warmth, you would not think first of sin. You would think of beginnings. of stored wisdom, of the weight of first things. You would smell wet earth and old fish and clay cooled by evening. You would feel that civilization itself was a fragile flame held over deep water. And if someone told you that in later ages this god of the deep would survive only as a whisper inside the body of a serpent, you might laugh, or perhaps you might not. Ancient memory has a habit of surviving in humiliating disguises. There is also the simple physical feeling of the Mesopotamian sacred world, which matters more than modern summary often allows. Eden, in many later paintings, becomes a cool European orchard with tidy light and innocent animals arranged like they are waiting for a portrait. The older world was stranger than that. It was humid, insect-filled, river-fed, unstable, fertile in a way that could become rot almost overnight. Sacredness there was not polished. It was lush and damp and always on the edge of overflow. A planted place beside divine water was not merely pretty. It was precious because it resisted chaos only through constant hidden support. That makes the garden prohibition feel different too. In a land where every ordered field depends on controlled flow, a boundary is never just an arbitrary rule. It is the condition by which life remains life and does not become swamp or salt or ruin. So when a divine figure linked to deep water and secret wisdom stands near a sacred tree, the whole scene acquires Mesopotamian pressure. This is not a suburban fruit argument. It is an event at the hinge between cultivated order and wider knowledge, between life sustained and life transformed. And perhaps that is why the later Eden story still feels so emotionally dense. It inherited not only motifs, but atmosphere. Beneath its compact Hebrew surface, one can still feel reeds in the wind, canals shining under dusk, temple walls cooling after heat, and the old southern conviction that every paradise must be watered from below, and that every source of life carries danger because what gives life can also flood it beyond repair. So, this is what I want us to carry forward from this part. Eden is not only a moral tale about obedience. It is also the transformed memory of older sacred landscapes where water flowed from divine source, where special plants and sacred knowledge belonged to gods of the deep, and where crossing a boundary changed the human condition forever. Beneath the biblical garden, there is another garden, or perhaps several layered together. Beneath the serpent, there is another voice. Beneath the tree, there are roots in Eridu mud. And if those roots are real, then the next question becomes even darker, because once older divine roles entered Hebrew scripture, they did not merely survive. They were judged, reframed, sometimes turned almost inside out. To understand how a God of wisdom could become the enemy of mankind, we have to move from sacred geography into theology itself, into the cold and brilliant place where stories are stripped down, reassigned, and made to serve a new vision of divine order. Once a story crosses from one religious world into another, it does not remain innocent. Images that once lived comfortably together begin to strain against new boundaries. A God who made sense in one sacred system may become intolerable in another. A garden can remain, but its meaning changes. A tree can remain, but its fruit becomes morally charged. A serpent can remain, but the old dignity has to be peeled away from it. This is the part of the journey where the mystery becomes sharper. Because now we are no longer asking only where the Eden story came from. We are asking what happened to it on the way. The ancient Mesopotamian world was full of divine complexity. Gods argued, deceived, negotiated, competed, regretted, relented, and acted within overlapping jurisdictions. No single deity absorbed all functions at once. Enki could be wise without being supreme. Enlil could be authoritative without being all things. Inanna could be dazzling, dangerous, and politically transformative without threatening the structure of divine plurality itself. This matters because in such a world, a figure like Enki can exist as the giver of civilization, the patron of craft, the serpent wise mediator, and still remain a legitimate god. But the world of Genesis is not built that way. Genesis belongs to a theological horizon in which one God stands at the center as creator, sovereign, legislator, and final source of order. Once that frame hardens, old distributed mythic roles have to be gathered up and reassigned. Some can be absorbed directly into the high God. Creation, sovereignty, blessing, judgment, the planting of a sacred garden. These are all functions that a monotheistic text can comfortably place in the divine center. But other roles are much more awkward. What do you do with the old giver of forbidden wisdom? What do you do with the divine figure who helps humanity cross limits that the higher order prefers to preserve? You displace him. That is the move I think we are watching in Eden. The narrative function survives, but the divine title does not. The ancient mediator of dangerous knowledge is pushed downward into the serpent form, still alak, still perceptive, still right about what knowledge will do, but no longer officially divine. He remains powerful in the story, but stripped of rank. He becomes, in a sense, a theological refugee. I know that phrase sounds dramatic, but I keep coming back to it because the serpent in Genesis feels too intelligent to be merely zoological. He speaks with the precision of someone who understands the structure of the prohibition better than the humans do. He knows what the fruit does. He knows what the humans lack. He knows what the higher command is really protecting. None of that feels like the invention of a random talking animal. It feels like the compressed residue of an older sacred office. And notice how the scene is arranged. The serpent does not simply say, "Do evil." The serpent says, "Your eyes will be opened. You will know." This is exactly the sort of proposition that later monotheistic moral teaching would need to become suspicious of, because it turns the acquisition of knowledge into the turning point of human history. If knowledge is what alters us, then the one who gives it has immense narrative importance. In older Mesopotamian stories, that giver could remain a god. In Genesis, that role becomes dangerous by definition. The text itself seems to preserve the discomfort. After Adam and Eve eat, the result is not immediate collapse into nonsense or annihilation. Their eyes are opened. They do know something new. They become aware of themselves in a transformed way. Even the divine response acknowledges that humanity has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. This line has always shivered in the text. It confirms the serpent's basic claim, even while condemning the act. It is as if the older tradition refuses to vanish completely. The serpent has been morally downgraded, but the truth it speaks cannot be erased. That is one reason later interpreters worked so hard to identify the serpent with Satan. The Genesis story itself does not explicitly do that. Not in its earliest plain form. The serpent is a serpent, cunning, speaking, dangerous, but not yet the full cosmic devil of much later theology. That later identification helps solve a problem. It gives the displaced wisdom giver a more stable villainous identity. It removes the uncomfortable ambiguity. Once the serpent becomes Satan, the story becomes easier for a stricter religious imagination to manage. But in the older text, the ambiguity still breathes. And ambiguity is exactly what we would expect if Genesis were preserving a transformed memory of Mesopotamian divine roles. The serpent still carries too much old intelligence, too much old sacred weight, too much narrative necessity. Strip away the later paint, and the outline underneath remains visible. This theological reframing becomes even clearer if we think about how much else the Hebrew writers inherited and reworked from Mesopotamian tradition. The flood story is the obvious example. A divinely sent deluge. A chosen survivor. Aveshel. Animals preserved. Birds sent out. Sacrifice after survival. No serious reader can miss the relationship between the Mesopotamian flood archive and Genesis. Yet no one thinks the Hebrew version is a simple copy. It is a reinterpretation. The same is true of creation itself, where watery chaos, divine speech, ordered sequence, and sacred rest all emerge in a world already shaped by older Near Eastern cosmology. Why would Eden be the lone exception, the one seen untouched by that long cultural conversation? It would be stranger if it were untouched. There is a historical reason for this too, and it matters more than people sometimes admit. During the Babylonian exile, Judean elites were brought into the heart of Mesopotamian imperial culture. They lived among its temples, canals, archives, and traditions. They heard its languages. They encountered its stories not as distant curiosities, but as the deep memory of the dominant civilization around them. If they then wrote or edited texts about beginnings, law, catastrophe, kingship, and divine order, it would have been almost impossible not to do so in conversation with that immense inherited world. And conversation is the right word, because the Hebrew writers are not passive borrowers. They are arguing, reshaping, answering, correcting. Their texts often feel like deliberate theological counterwriting. The old world said one thing. Now we will say another. The old gods were many. Now God is one. The old benefactor gave dangerous knowledge. Now that giver becomes the serpent. The old sacred center was in Mesopotamia. Now the true story of humanity is retold under a different covenant and a different God. In that light, Eden becomes not just inheritance, but argumen. It is a rebuttal written with borrowed architecture. The garden remains, but the theological center changes. The tree remains, but its meaning sharpens into obedience. The serpent remains, but its old prestige is stripped and morally reversed. Humanity remains the creature caught between innocence and dangerous awakening. But now the blame is clearer, the warning firmer, the exile more explicitly deserved. And yet the old story never disappears entirely. That is the fascinating part. The serpent still shines with too much intelligence. The fruit still does what the serpent says. The knowledge itself is still real. If the Eden writer wanted only a stupid villain, the text could have given him one. Instead, it gives us a being who sounds uncomfortably like the remnant of an older wisdom figure speaking through reduced status. There is even a sort of tragic dignity in that reduction. The old god of life-giving water, civilizational gift, clever mercy, and sacred danger has been flattened into an adversarial creature on the ground. He is still there, but lower. Still truthful in key ways, but condemned. Still crucial to human becoming, but written out of official divinity. That is not just demonization. It is theological conquest. This helps explain something else that has long puzzled readers. Why the serpent later becomes such an unstable symbol across biblical and post-biblical tradition. Sometimes condemned. Sometimes curiously powerful. Sometimes linked to healing, as with the bronze serpent lifted in the wilderness. That episode is one of the most revealing in the whole biblical world, because it refuses to let serpent imagery remain simple. A bronze serpent becomes the instrument through which healing is mediated. People look and live. It is a shocking survival of an older symbolic logic. Serpent, danger, healing, life. The same old cluster refuses to die, which is exactly what we would expect if the serpent carried the memory of older Near Eastern divine functions. Symbols with that much history do not become obedient overnight. So here, by the fire, I think the most honest thing we can say is not that the case is perfectly closed, but that the pattern is extraordinarily strong. The Eden serpent looks less and less like a fresh invention the more closely we read Mesopotamian myth. It looks instead like the narrowed afterlife of older gods of wisdom, threshold crossing, sacred plants, and dangerous revelation. Enki gives us the generous, cunning mind. Ningishzida gives us the serpent tree gate presence. Genesis fuses the inherited atmosphere into one unforgettable figure and then morally inverts him. That inversion is the real cold stroke of genius in the later story. The benefactor becomes suspect. The awakener becomes tempter. The one who opens the eyes becomes the cause of exile. And because the transformation is so successful, later readers forget how much tenderness, complexity, and ancient sacred memory still cling to the serpent's skin. By the end of this part, I want you to carry one final image into the dark. A scribe in exile, lamp burning low, writing in a world already full of older stories. He does not invent from nothing. He chooses. He arranges. He judges. He keeps the garden, keeps the tree, keeps the serpent, but changes the moral weather around them. And in that changed weather, an old Mesopotamian god loses his name, his temple, and his throne, but not quite his voice. That voice is still there in the garden, soft, dangerous, and terribly persuasive, saying what heaven does not want said aloud, that once the fruit is taken, Human beings will never again remain what they were before. The strangest thing about symbols is that even after theology condemns them, they keep remembering what they used to mean. That is exactly what happens with the serpent after Eden. The story seems at first to have settled the matter. The serpent speaks. Humanity crosses the line. The garden is lost, and the creature is left carrying blame in the imagination of later generations. It sounds final. It sounds clean. It sounds like victory for the newer theological frame. But the older world never quite lets go. The first clue is not hidden in some obscure tablet buried in a museum basement. It is sitting inside the biblical tradition itself, and it has made readers uncomfortable for centuries. In the wilderness story, when the people are struck by poisonous serpents, Moses is told to make a bronze serpent and lift it up. Whoever looks upon it lives. It is one of the most startling symbolic reversals in all of Scripture. The image of the serpent, supposedly bound to deception and downfall, becomes the image through which healing passes. That is not the kind of thing that happens when a symbol has been fully tamed. It happens when a symbol is older than the framework trying to control it. It happens when the memory inside the image is stronger than the moral label placed upon it. The bronze serpent scene is the ancient world blinking through the later text. Danger and healing, venom and remedy, death and restored life, all folded together in one lifted sign. That is profoundly Mesopotamian in its emotional logic. It belongs to the same symbolic climate that produced serpent staff imagery, deep gods, underworld thresholds, and the uneasy truth that what harms may also heal when properly understood. Even the physical feeling of the bronze serpent matters. Imagine it in desert light, metal catching the sun, dust lifting around tired feet, people staring upward because they have run out of simpler options. That is not the atmosphere of childish superstition. It is the atmosphere of concentrated symbolic inheritance. The serpent there is no mere villain. It is a dangerous conduit, a sign carrying older power through a newer story. Of course, later reformers disliked this intensely. One tradition remembers that the bronze serpent, called Nehushtan, had to be destroyed because people were burning incense to it. That detail is revealing in all the right ways. People do not venerate a symbol for generations unless it continues to feel alive. The image kept pulling reverence toward itself, because reverence had always clung to it. The serpent could be denounced, but it could not be made trivial. That persistence is part of what sends us into the later ancient world, into the strange and flickering territory of the Gnostics. Now, I want to tread carefully here, because Gnosticism is often thrown around like a bag for every dramatic religious idea anyone finds exciting after midnight. The historical traditions were diverse, difficult, and often at odds with one another. Still, some Gnostic texts do something extraordinary with Eden. They do not treat the serpent as the enemy of humanity. They treat the serpent as the liberator, the awakener, the one who tells the truth against an ignorant or controlling ruler. When I first read those texts years ago, what struck me was not their shock value, but how old they felt. Not old in the sense of direct quotation, but old in symbolic instinct. It was as if the ancient Near Eastern memory of the benefactor serpent had risen through the cracks of later theology and started speaking again. In works such as the hypostasis of the archons and related material, the creator figure of the material world is not always the highest source of truth. Authority itself becomes suspect. The command not to eat can be read not as loving protection, but as control. Knowledge becomes emancipation. The serpent becomes the one who interrupts spiritual captivity. Suddenly, the old Mesopotamian pattern is visible again. A higher power restricts. A serpent figure mediates awakening. Humanity passes from passive innocence into conscious sight. That does not mean the Gnostics were secretly preserving clean Sumerian theology in a hidden basement somewhere. Nothing so tidy. It means the old symbolic grammar remained available. When later thinkers began to question official readings of Eden, the serpent's older function returned almost immediately. That is what old symbols do. They reassemble their lost meanings when pressure is taken off them. There is even something grimly funny about it. You can spend centuries preaching that the serpent is only the villain, and the moment a few restless minds start rereading the scene, the old benefactor role slithers right back into view. Ancient mythology, it turns out, is passionate. It can wait out entire orthodoxies. This is also why I think the Eden story is more powerful when read through deep history rather than through a single, later, dogmatic lens. Once you allow the Mesopotamian background into the room, everything becomes more layered. The serpent is no longer just an external tempter whispering evil. It becomes the bearer of a civilizational question. Should humanity remain in managed innocence, or should humanity awaken into knowledge, burden, mortality, labor, history, and self-consciousness? The fruit becomes not mere disobedience, but a threshold. And yes, thresholds are rarely comfortable. If Enki stands behind part of this story, and Ningishzida stands behind another part, then the Eden serpent carries more than temptation. It carries initiation. It is the figure who says that after tonight, after this act, after this knowing, nothing will ever again be sheltered in quite the same way. You will hurt more. You will fear more. You will work harder. You will lose the old garden, but you will also see. That is why the scene continues to trouble people. The serpent's gift is not simple pleasure. It is consciousness. Consciousness is a strange gift. It lets us make music and calendars and cities and treaties. It lets us ask what justice is and why the stars move and whether love means more because it dies. It also lets us notice our nakedness, our mortality, our failures, our distance from one another. It makes us historical creatures. Once the eyes are opened, we do not get to go back to being merely inside life. We stand in front of it. We observe it. We judge it. We remember it. We dread it. We write it down on tablets, parchment, papier, and glowing screens because we cannot bear to let it pass without witness. That is a very Enki kind of gift. Useful, dangerous, irreversible. And if you think about the whole arc from Sumer to Genesis to late antique reinterpretation, that is exactly the thread that refuses to break. The giver of knowledge may be praised, demoted, vilified, reimagined, suppressed, or rescued, but the gift remains the same. The serpent does not merely invite appetite. The serpent activates humanity's second life, the inward life of reflection. This is where the story becomes more melancholy than sinister for me. Because once you read Eden this way, the expulsion from the garden stops looking like a simple punishment and starts looking like the cost of becoming fully human. The old peace cannot survive awakened consciousness. A being who knows good and evil cannot remain in a nursery. A creature that sees itself cannot stay inside unconscious harmony. History begins the moment the fruit is understood. That, too, is deeply consonant with Mesopotamian thought. The old myths do not imagine humanity as permanently fit for paradise. They imagine us as transitional beings, gifted and burdened, near the divine and cut off from it, wise but mortal, capable of ritual and law and craft because someone handed us dangerous insight. We are creatures of the in-between, not gods, not beasts, not innocent anymore, not complete either. No wonder the serpent kept returning in later imagination. It is the emblem of that in-between state. It touches the ground yet sheds its skin. It can disappear and reappear. It can kill and cure. It belongs to roots, to hidden chambers, to underworld passages, to springtime renewal, to healing staffs, to old temples, to the body and what moves beneath the body. It is perhaps the most perfect possible image for a knowledge that transforms without comforting. And still, even with all of that, we should keep one foot on the ground. Some scholars will say the parallels are thematic rather than genealogical. Some will say the serpent as wisdom figure appears in many cultures, and that direct inheritance can be overstated. That caution is real and necessary. We do not become more truthful by becoming reckless. But caution is not the same as blindness. When rivers, gardens, trees, deep waters, wisdom gods, sacred thresholds, healing serpents, divine food, and awakened human sight all gather in one narrative constellation, the old Mesopotamian sky is very hard not to see. So by the end of this part, I think the most honest conclusion is a quiet one. The serpent in Eden was never only one thing. It was never merely an animal and never merely the later devil. It was a vessel, a narrowed, darkened vessel, yes, but one still carrying ancient cargo. Inside it moved the memory of Enki, the giver who could not stop wisdom from leaking outward. Inside it moved the shadow of Ningishzida, lord of the good tree and keeper of thresholds. Inside it moved the old symbolic logic of healing, danger, initiation, and irreversible sight. The garden story tried to settle the question. Later interpreters tried to settle it even harder. But the serpent has remained too alive for that. It kept glinting in bronze. It kept returning in hidden texts. It kept drawing the attention of readers who noticed that its words changed humanity not by falsehood, but by revelation. And once revelation enters a story, the story never belongs entirely to authority again. That question reaches farther than religion alone. It reaches into art, medicina, law, and memory, cultures built under the sign of too little knowledge do not survive long. Cultures built under the sign of dangerous knowledge survive differently. They become scribal, analytical, suspicious, inventive. They build archives because revelation is fragmentary. They train healers because the body is wounded. They map the stars because order is hidden. The serpent's gift, in that sense, is not only inward consciousness. It is civilization's unrest, the refusal to remain within first instructions when first instructions no longer answer the size of human hunger. Perhaps that is why later authority feared the serpent so much. A creature that only causes vice can be punished. A creature that awakens inquiry is much harder to contain. That is where the final stretch will take us, into the quiet, after all the arguments, into the deeper reason this old serpent still matters. Not because it helps us win a theological quarrel, but because it asks what kind of creature humanity became when knowledge entered us, and whether that moment of awakening was our ruin, or the first terrible beginning of everything that makes us human. There is one more small thing I do not want to lose before the night closes. Ancient stories endure, not because they answer everything, but because they hold together truths that ordinary language prefers to split apart. The serpent is dangerous and illuminating. The garden is beautiful and restrictive. Knowledge is liberating and wounding. Exile is punishment and beginning. Enki, if he stands behind the figure at all, is generous and manipulative, merciful and destabilizing. That complexity is not a flaw in the tradition. It is the sign that we are standing near something real about human experience. Only shallow stories sort everything too quickly. And the old Mesopotamian world was not shallow. It had watched floods, sickness, dynasties, and dust too long for that. Its myths learned to speak in layers because life itself came in layers. Water below the earth, city above the mud, temple above the water, God above the temple, and beneath each layer another question waiting. Maybe that is the final kinship between Enki and the serpent. Both belong to what lies beneath the obvious surface. Both speak from below, from roots, from hidden water, from the part of reality polite certainty would rather keep covered. And every now and then, when someone listens, that buried voice changes the whole human world again. When all the arguments grow tired, and they always do, what remains is the human figure standing just outside the garden. Not the theologian, not the polemicist, not the empire that tried to own the story. Just the human figure, newly conscious, newly ashamed, newly alive to death, carrying knowledge like a fire that cannot be put back into the wood. That is where I think this ancient mystery finally wants to leave us. Because in the end, the question is not only whether Enki stands behind the serpent, or whether Ningishzida's shadow curls through the tree, or whether exile sharpened the Hebrew retelling of old Mesopotamian themes. All of that matters. Yes, and it matters deeply. But the reason these stories survived thousands of years is even simpler and more intimate. They survived because they describe the feeling of becoming human, not the sentimental version of humanity that likes to imagine itself as naturally noble and steadily improving, but the older, sadder version, the one that knows self-awareness is costly. the one that understands that to know more is often to lose peace, the one that suspects wisdom is never a toy and never arrives without consequence. That is why I cannot hear the Eden serpent as a flat enemy anymore. Even if later tradition wanted that simplicity, the older layers resisted. If the serpent carries Enki's old function, then what it offers is not destruction for its own sake. It offers awakening. Dangerous awakening. Yes. The kind that breaks shelter. The kind that introduces labor, grief, moral burden, and the long ache of memory. But awakening nonetheless. In a way, that is the most Mesopotamian thing imaginable. The people between the rivers did not tell naive stories about progress. Their gods flooded cities. Their kings died. Their healers treated bodies that still failed. Their scribes copied laments as carefully as they copied hymns. They knew civilization was fragile. They knew knowledge was double-edged. They knew consciousness did not save anyone from mortality. It only made mortality impossible to ignore. So if the serpent in Eden preserves something of that older world, then the story stops being childish. It becomes one of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world's most concentrated reflections on what consciousness costs. I think that is why the scene remains so powerful, even for people who no longer accept any later orthodox reading of it. A command is given. A limit is drawn. A voice appears at the edge of obedience and says, "No, there is more here than you have been told. Take it, and your world will grow larger and darker at once." That is not just theology. That is every threshold of adulthood, every threshold of culture, every threshold of history. The first lie a child sees through. The first death a mind truly understands. The first moment someone realizes authority can conceal as well as protect. The first book that changes a life and makes the old life impossible to return to. No wonder the story never sleeps. There is also a cruel beauty in the fact that once knowledge enters, the old innocence cannot simply be restored. This is where some later readings, especially the more severe ones, become emotionally thin for me. They want the whole scene to be about punishment. But punishment is only part of what happens. The deeper change is ontological. Humanity crosses into reflective existence. Adam and Eve do not merely break a rule. They become the kind of beings who know they have broken a rule. That is a different order of reality. And there again the old Mesopotamian texture rises under the Hebrew surface. Adapa returns from heaven wiser and still mortal. Atrahasis survives the flood and enters a narrowed world. Gilgamesh learns and still cannot seize immortality. The wise one sees more and therefore suffers more. Knowledge is never simple gain. It is enlargement with wound. If you listen closely, that same enlargement with wound is the pulse beneath Eden. This is why I think the serpent's afterlife matters beyond comparative mythology. The serpent is one of the great images of the human threshold. It stands at the point where protected life becomes conscious life. It stands between obedience and insight, between rest and history, between garden and city. The old world understood that cities themselves are born from that crossing. Once the garden is lost, humanity builds walls, laws, tools, liturgy, calendars, archives. We become makers because we are no longer merely dwellers. Enki, if he stands behind this, is the patron of that shift. He is the giver of arts, measures, crafts, sacred offices, civilizational structures. He is exactly the sort of divine figure you would expect to lurk behind a myth where humanity leaves one mode of being and enters another, harder, more technical, more historical, more self-aware mode of existence. To receive his gift is to lose simplicity and gain the world. That may be why later monotheistic redactors had to darken him. A god who gives the world at the price of innocence is far harder to accommodate than a simple tempter who ruins everything for spite. The first figure is tragic. The second is manageable. Institutions prefer manageable enemies. Still, tragedy lasts longer than simplification. That is why, even now, the old serpent keeps slipping free of the labels placed upon it. Artists return to it. Mystics return to it. Psychologists return to it. Scholars return to it. Even ordinary readers, sitting alone at night, return to it, because somewhere in the body, they feel that the serpent did not merely cause disaster. It announced an irreversible truth. To be human is to know. To know is to suffer. To suffer is to make meaning anyway. If that sounds bleak, I do not think it finally is. Dark, yes, but not bleak. Because the same knowledge that burdens us also makes love possible in its deepest form. A creature that knows loss can cherish. A creature that knows death can bless a passing day. A creature that knows injustice can seek justice. A creature that knows exile can build hospitality. The garden is lost, but the city, for all its noise and sorrow, can become a place of memory, craft, tenderness, ritual, law, and song. Enki's gift, if that is what it is, does not leave us only naked in the dust. It leaves us capable, and responsible. That is the sting in the tail of the whole story. Once the fruit is taken, once the eyes are opened, humanity can no longer hide inside innocent dependence. We become answerable for what we build from what we have learned. In that sense, the serpent gives freedom, but also burden. And freedom with burden is a very old, very sober idea. It feels much older than later sermons that make the whole scene into a simple morality play. So where does that leave us? Here, I think, with a garden that has older roots than many readers realize, with a serpent that carries the memory of Mesopotamian gods of wisdom, thresholds, healing, and dangerous truth, with a story that was rewritten under new theological conditions and yet could not fully hide its inheritance, with a humanity that may not have been ruined by knowledge so much as initiated into history by it. And perhaps that is the final reason the serpent still matters. It reminds us that some of the most important things in civilization come from crossing a line we were told not to cross. Not every line, of course. Wisdom is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. But the history of thought is full of moments when a guarded truth had to be approached by the brave, the curious, the wounded, or the desperate. Every science begins with a forbidden question. Every philosophy begins with dissatisfaction. Every mature faith begins the moment inherited certainty stops being enough. The serpent, in that deeper sense, is not merely a biblical creature. It is an emblem of the mind at the edge of the known. That edge can be lonely. It can feel cold. It can cost belonging. But it is also where the human story becomes fully human. Outside the garden, under harsher light, mortality begins to count time. Shame becomes clothing. Labor becomes agriculture. Grief becomes ritual. Memory becomes writing. The species that once walked in unreflective shelter begins building civilization out of loss and insight. Which means the story ends, not in the garden, but in us. In the questions we keep asking. In the old books we cannot stop reopening. In the way the figure of the serpent continues to disturb every reading that tries to make it too simple. In the way deep history keeps returning through the cracks of official doctrine. In the way ancient Mesopotamia, with its mud, its reeds, its hidden water, and its gods of dangerous wisdom, still breathes beneath later scripture, like groundwater beneath stone. So let the fire go low now. Let the room dim around the edges. Imagine Eridu again. Marsh wind moving through reeds. Temple walls damp with night. A priest lifting a bow. Somewhere below the floor, the deep, sweet waters of the Abzu holding their silence. Imagine a serpent traced on a seal, a staff on a cup, a gate half open, a tree standing in a still place where knowledge waits. Imagine that the old stories never really vanished. They only changed clothes and kept walking. The serpent in Eden may have been condemned, but condemnation is not the same as erasure. The old benefactor still flickers there, under the skin of the tail, still offering the oldest and most terrible gift, the opening of the eyes. Carry that gently into sleep, not as dogma, not as a little scandal to wave at the world tomorrow, just as an old possibility. That beneath one of the most famous stories ever told, there still lies the wet, shining memory of a Mesopotamian god who loved humanity enough, or perhaps recklessly enough, to let wisdom slip into our hands. And once it was there, nothing on earth could ever become simple again. Good night.